Recently, I've been reading the late 18th century poet William Cowper's long poem, The Task, which is, I think, roughly 100 pages in print in blank verse, so iambic pentameter, unrhymed. And it was a hugely influential poem, particularly for the Romantic poets. Coleridge uh, remarked on how impressed he was by the kind of conversational tone of it, which was quite an innovation um, after many centuries wherein poetry was supposed to have a kind of elevated language. The task really broke new ground in being the sort of unfolding thoughts of someone in a more natural way. Something which obviously Wordsworth took on with the lyrical ballads. But also, it's a poem significant for just how much it set the tone for evangelical Anglicanism of the time, um, which Cowper was very much at the roots of. Obviously, he was friends with John Newton, the former slave ship owner who uh, turned his hand to the abolitionist cause. And this sort of social concern is a big theme of the poem. So after starting with the conceit of writing a poem about a sofa, Cowper spins out the poem in many interesting directions, and that's one of the things I most enjoyed about it, was just the interest of seeing what he would turn his mind to next. So he does talk about slavery and the evils of slavery, but he also talks about the evils of imperialism more generally. He's quite radical in his indictment of the army and of the corrupting influence of life in the army and so on. He sounds the key notes of the evangelical revival in Anglicanism when he criticises the clergy of the day for their uh, style over substance, for their lack of moral seriousness, which was a key thing for figures like William Wilberforce and other evangelical Anglicans. And I mean, I'm thinking of Roy Porter's history of the 18th century, where he notes that apparently the most popular texts to preach on were "Be not righteous overmuch," which is from Ecclesiastes, and "His commandments are not grievous," which you can just imagine an 18th century parson preaching to a congregation full of snoozing squires. But evangelicals like Cowper and Wilberforce were desperately wanting to bring a new moral seriousness, not only to preaching, but to social work in general. Um, and what really changed British culture from being essentially one of licentiousness, of quite open drunkenness and debauchery in any number of ways, was, I think, the French Revolution, which happened just a few years after Cowper wrote this poem. And fascinatingly, he actually refers to the Bastille. He refers to the terrible tyranny in France. But of course, conservatives were dismayed by the unfolding events. And it was probably the revolution that really made the upper classes in Britain realise they had to shape up. They had to cease a certain kind of hypocrisy. They had to at least appear to be morally upright and serious. And this is probably what ultimately changed British culture in the direction of the Victorian gentleman, ultimately, who of course could be as hypocritical as his 18th century ancestors, but at least had a formal code which was very different. And so it's fascinating to see how Cooper plays in with that. But as a poem, it's a lot more than a social poem. There's some fantastic passages about nature. The famous line, God made the country, man made town, says a lot, and itself was clearly a big part of the Romantics' feelings about nature and the morally edifying purpose of nature. I also love how at the centre of the poem it's revealed that the task is really to make compost and grow things in your garden, which appeals to me in many ways. And so Cooper sort of rambles around, discusses all these things in a way that takes us along with him, takes us on this journey. And while I can criticise a number of things about it, so while he shows concern for the poor, and as I said, has certain radical aspects to his thinking, he then does take the rather Tory line of, well, most of the poor are poor because they're lazy, because they just don't want to work. And maybe this represents something of the ambiguity for me of figures like Wilberforce, who, as much as I can obviously sympathise with their anti-slavery campaigning and so on, were part of a privileged class that had significant blind spots. So Eric Williams, who wrote a famous book called Capitalism and Slavery, in which he argued that it was really the proceeds from the slave trade that provided the funds for the Industrial Revolution. In that book, he says something like Wilberforce knew more about what was happening in the hold of a slave ship than at the bottom of a mine shaft. And there's certainly a sense in which Wilberforce was not really in sympathy with the lower orders of the time. E.P. Thompson, in his classic Making of the English Working Classes, notes that Wilberforce was often trying to ban the simpler pleasures of the lower orders, their festivals or many of their pastimes, in a way that hardly endeared him to them. And of course, despite the evangelicals' best intentions, and their intentions were in the main good, Britain found many other ways of making the world a worse place for its own benefit. But do pick the poem up if you can and have a read and see what you think.